Thank you. Thank you very much to my good friend Maynard Moore. It's good to be collaborating with you. It's also good to be welcoming so many people to this seminar, members of the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science, or perhaps members of the organization that I'm chiefly connected with, the International Society for Science and Religion, and members of the general public, as we think tonight about the risks of the future and specifically the growing impact of the human presence on this planet as we grow in numbers and in technological powers to alter the ecosystem upon which life depends. And we have no better speaker for that particular topic than tonight's guest. Let me say first, however, that at the end of the presentation, we hope to have time for discussion. And let me invite you to pose questions by typing them into the question and answer function. Now, if you look down to the bottom of your screen, right to the center bottom, you'll see a little link that says Q&A. If you open that, you'll be able to type a question, make it brilliant, make it succinct, make it challenging, and I will sift through them and probably be able to get to many of them as we go into the final portion of tonight's event. But it is my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Dr. William Rees. Bill is a professor emeritus from the, and former director, I should add, of the University of British Columbia at the School of Community and Regional Planning. He is one of those who doesn't simply worry about the future, as I do and as many of you do, but finds ways to quantify precisely the human presence, the human impact on the vital systems that sustain not just human life, but all life on Earth. He has developed measurement devices that make it possible to argue based on quantifiable data approaches about the human impact. Drawing on that experience, he's going to share with us tonight on the topic of, will modern civilization be the death of us? Does our modern technological industrial society destroy the biophysical basis of our existence? Bill?
Thank you very much, Ron. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to this session, and a very deep honor for me to have been asked to repeat what we did in Seattle. It was a very exciting evening, and as I say, it's a pleasure to be here, and I welcome all of you. What I have to share with you is a kind of a personal journey, I suppose. It involves some philosophy, some economics, some ecology, and a variety of other disciplines. It's a kind of transdisciplinary look at what I call the human predicament. I suppose a lot of people would call it other things, but I think we really are in a predicament of grand scale. So with that kind of introduction, I'll jump right into the slides. And can everyone see that? I think we should be able to at this point. And I'll advance. This was the title we were given at Seattle, and I tried to stay as close to it as I could. So the premise for my presentation is that the human enterprise is already in a state of what I would call ecological as well as cultural overshoot. And when we are in a state of overshoot, it means that the human enterprise is using natural resources, both renewable and non-renewable resources, and natural waste sinks faster than ecosystems can regenerate. And we are dumping wastes at rates far in excess of those which natural systems can assimilate and recycle. And the symptoms are, I suppose, the stuff of headlines. So greenhouse gases are accumulating. As a result, the climate is changing. The oceans are acidifying. Fresh waters are toxifying. The seas are overfished. Soils are eroding, et cetera, et cetera. We've all heard about these things. We've been hearing about them for 50 or 60 years. So it's been a real interest of mine to try to understand why it is that despite these extensive warnings of scientists, the cascade of data that these things are happening, we've tended to ignore them. So we've entered this period in our history of what I would call ecologically destructive, uneconomic growth. A tip of the hat to Herman Daly, one of the great ecological economists. Yes, the economy is growing, but arguably, if you look at this list of costs, which are not accounted for in our economic system, they exceed the benefits. And therefore, the growth that we're experiencing right now is indeed uneconomic. So overshoot is a term that I've used, and I want to give you some quantitative sense of just how great a problem this is. So if we look at the human ecological footprint, this is a tool that I've developed with my students over the last 30 years or so, but we now have a very good metric by which we can trace all the material and energy flows through the human economy and trace these back to the land which either produces them or assimilates the wastes associated with their use and production. So basically, I would say the first question of human ecology is just how much of the Earth's surface is necessary to support just me in the style to which I am accustomed. And we can now do that, answer that question for most of the world's countries. If you take this on the global scale, which is what this slide shows, the total area of productive landscape and waterscape on the planet amounts to about pardon me, 12.2 billion hectares. Right now, humans are using the Earth as if there were 20.5 billion hectares. So basically, we are using this planet as if it were about 60 to 70% larger than it actually is. Now, any school child would ask the obvious question, how can you be using a planet that's larger than one you live on? And the answer is because over the eons of time, nature has built up enormous natural capital, huge stocks of soil, of oil, natural gas, of fish stocks, forests, so on and so forth. We are using these then at a rate far in excess of their replacement rates. And we can be in this state of overshoot for a considerable period of time until, of course, we absolutely hit rock bottom. But the bottom line is that humans are consuming and dissipating the planet faster than nature can regenerate. And as the population grows, as per capita material consumption grows, this means that everybody is increasingly in competition with everyone else on the Earth for a diminishing supply of biocapacity. Okay. Now, the obvious question is, how can this be? And I think, by the way, I'm compressing an enormous amount of information here, but I think we can boil this down to two basic factors. The first is a basic human nature. It's our genetic predisposition, something we share with virtually every other species that's ever been studied on the planet. And that is that human beings, like all other species, have a tendency to expand. Our populations will expand to fill all accessible habitat, and we will use up all the available resources. Now, a unique quality of human beings, of course, is that through technology, we can constantly increase the availability of resources. We can mine ever poorer sources of minerals, for example, because of improving technology and the refining and the concentration of those elements. So technology has given humans a huge leg up in this competitive struggle for the acquisition of resources. Some people tend to doubt these qualities, but I ask you a simple question. If we go back to filling all accessible habitat, think of what would happen if we discovered somehow out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, another island, say the size of Australia, that was untrammeled by human use and an absolute verdant paradise. Would we say, well, you know, we've kind of screwed up everywhere else, let's leave that as it is? And the answer to that question is obviously not. Every major nation on the planet would be in there as quickly as possible, planting its flag and staking a claim to what that new discovery had brought us. Now, the second factor is causal to it's creative nurture. So the first factor had to do with nature, and here nurture comes into it. This is the socialization of human beings. Human beings are unique in another way, and that is that we socially construct what we take to be reality. In other words, we socially construct perceptual lenses through which we view the rest of the world. And the problem is that the nature of those conceptual lenses determines the reality that we perceive. So every culture perceives reality in a slightly different way, having pre-constructed slightly different lenses. And it's extremely important to understand that this sounds like a kind of flaky concept. The reality is that social constructs are extremely powerful. And when you think about it, all of our traditional myths, our political ideologies, our social and economic paradigms, even our cultural narratives, are ultimately conceived by the human mind. They're shaped over time through human discourse and debate, and they ultimately become received wisdom. And that is our perception of the world. Now, the point really is, though, that not all of these social constructs can be equally valid. Some of them are nurturing of spirit, supportive of community, harmonious with nature, or otherwise adaptive. But others are positively hazardous, both to humankind and other life on Earth. And it doesn't really matter which of these holds at any particular time. The really key issue here is that people live out of their social constructs as if they were real. At the present time, I think it's fair to say that the whole of the world community is in the thrall of what we've called earlier in this discussion, a techno-industrial narrative. Our neoliberal economics and that techno-industrial narrative tend to reinforce our innate expansionism. So in many respects, from the perspective of sustainability, we're in the worst of all possible worlds, because we have evolved a natural predisposition to expand and consume resources to the limit, and we now have a social construct on top of that, which reinforces that natural tendency. So if you think of our neoliberal market economics, it promotes self-interest and efficiency. These are the two quintessential variables, if you will, in utility maximization, which really means accumulation of stuff. It considers the market a theoretically perfect market as the, whoops, where did we go here? As the arbiter of all social values. Government should stay out of these affairs. The market is the real place in which decisions should be made. And this really means, and it's a very important point, that ethical and moral considerations are disallowed. Economics does not deal in ethical or moral considerations, so that family and community are not part of our market calculus. Compassion for others is also an extra market characteristic. At bottom then, our neoliberal economic paradigm assumes unlimited economic progress propelled by boundless technological innovation. And one of the most ebullient expressions of this was from Dr. Julian Simon, Professor Simon at the University of Maryland, who said, "We have in our hands now the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years." Now that's an arithmetically challenged concept, but it's the kind of thing that people want to hear. It's the kind of thing we'd like to believe, because if you have this as a major component, as a major plank in your socially constructive political platform, for example, then you can dismiss concerns about the environment or inequality as non-entities. These will be resolved over time as the economy grows, as we become richer and richer, and more stuff becomes available. So these are very, very powerful ideas, and they are what's driving the planet at the present time. Now, when you combine our base nature, this predisposition to expand, with our modernist nurture, what we have found in the recent past, and by that I mean just the last couple of 100 years, is a mind-blowing rate of geometric growth. Consider this. The human species in its modern form has been around for 200, 300,000 years. Let's just take 200,000 years as an easy starting point. So it took about 200,000 years of human history for a population to reach its first billion early in the 1800s, so in the 19th century. But in the intervening 200 years, the population has expanded an additional 7.5-fold, 1/1000th of much time we had a 7-fold expansion, and we will top 7.8 billion people in this year in 2020. Meanwhile, the gross world product, the real value of the economy and essentially consumption, has increased 100-fold, and per capita consumption by a factor of 13, increasing to 25 in rich countries. So there's been this enormous expansion in just 200 years, 1/1000th as much time as it took to reach the first billion. We expanded to almost 8 billion today and increased our ecological footprint by a factor of 100. Meanwhile, of course, the Earth didn't get any larger. Now, this is what it looks like when plotted over that 10,000 or just the last 10,000 year period, basically since the foundation of permanent settlements with the development and spread of agriculture. Notice that the population was essentially flat for the first 6,000 or 7,000 years. We started to tick up a few 100 years ago, but the real explosion began early in the 19th century with the advent of extensive use of fossil fuel. And this is an extremely important thing to keep in mind in our present era. Fossil fuel is the means by which humankind has obtained all of the other resources needed to grow the population and to create the infrastructure, our cities, our automobiles, all the toys and infrastructure of modern civilization would not be possible in the absence of abundant, cheap energy. So what fossil fuel did essentially was liberate humankind from natural negative feedbacks. So a negative feedback is something that represses the natural tendency to grow. So in the absence of adequate food and resources, in the presence of disease and so on and so forth, the human population was kept well below the potential of its exponential growth. Once fossil fuel came into the picture, we literally took the cap off the bottle and enabled us to exercise for the first time in our own evolutionary history the full biological potential to grow at an exponential rate. Now, the point that we really should take from this, however, is that it's only been the last 7 to perhaps 10 generations of human beings who have experienced sufficient growth or technological change in their lifetimes even to notice it. So if you were to go back, say, a couple of 1,000 years, you might live to be 100, some people did, but you wouldn't notice any particular change in the course of your lifetime. The technology in place at the time of your birth would be the same as that at the time of your death. Today, everything's changed. Almost everything that we take to be modern didn't exist when I was born back in the early 1940s. So the pace of change is absolutely astronomical. And we tend to take this for granted without really consciously absorbing the inordinate changes that have taken place in the last little while. Most remarkably, humans alive today, perhaps the 7th or 8th generation who've experienced this, take 2 and 3% per year growth to be the norm. So our generation and perhaps a few generations before us think growth is a norm, when in fact this period of growth, as this graph clearly shows, and keep in mind we could have extended it the full 200 years out to the left, this is the single most abnormal period in human history, and it is the period that we take to be the norm. And it's not just the human population that expanded. As I indicated earlier, per capita incomes have increased by a factor of 13 in just the last 100 years or so. And that's 25-fold in rich countries like the United States and Canada. And so with the population, we've seen a much larger expansion of consumption. So this is just a collection of graphs showing super exponential growth in many other commodities and things that humans do, such as visits to McDonald's restaurants. Now, one of the interesting, I suppose, facts about exponential growth, we have a constant doubling time, and anything that happens in the course of one of those doubling times is equal to the sum of everything that occurred in the previous collection of doubling times. So this means that 1/2 of all the fossil fuels and many other resources ever used by human beings have been consumed in just the past 30 years, in the most recent doubling of our technological society. So what we have seen is an incredible expansion in the rate at which human beings are exploiting the planet. And many people who are concerned about ecological problems or the environmental issues are convinced that technological efficiency will get us off the hook. But I have to point out that it's been during a period of unprecedented improvements in efficiency, both in technology and in economics, that this most explosive period of human growth has taken place. It's an utter myth to assume that efficiency gains are going to lead to conservation. In fact, history shows us that with increasing efficiency, we often see a reduction in prices, an increase in income. You have more money chasing fewer goods and cheaper goods and services, and so of course consumption increases in marked step with efficiency. Now, one of the major constraints that we have to deal with is that we are wedded intellectually to this neoliberal economic paradigm. And yet the neoliberal growth models contain absolutely no useful information whatsoever about the structural and dynamic properties of ecosystems. The fact that they are interdependent, that they behave with lags and thresholds, all sorts of discontinuous behaviors, there are irreversibilities and so on in the ecosystems. And in addition, the economic models have very little important to say about the social systems with which the economy interacts in the real world. So it's almost as if we're trying to fly planet Earth with the intellectual equivalent of a 1955 Volkswagen Beetle driver's manual. There's simply nothing useful in the model that tells us how to manage the macro systems, the ecological systems, the ecosphere, and the social systems that we're trying to go manage here. So what could possibly go wrong in those circumstances? And the answer, of course, is plenty. And one of the best known symptoms, and again, I have to emphasize we're looking at just a very shallow examination of what's happening out there, but one of the best known symptoms is the increasing index of atmospheric carbon dioxide. This is a plot taken directly from the website of the Mauna Loa Observatory of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Research Laboratory in Hawaii. The measurements are so sensitive, even though this research station is thousands of kilometers or miles away from major source of carbon dioxide, that you can see the seasonal cycles. The upticks occur during the northern hemisphere winters when most of the world's vegetation is relatively dormant. And so carbon dioxide being injected into the atmosphere tends to accumulate when photosynthesis is shut down. Conversely, the downticks are the periods of the spring and summer in the northern hemisphere as carbon dioxide is being assimilated by plants, being converted to biomass. The atmospheric levels of carbon decline. But each year for the past couple of 100 years, the upticks are very slightly longer than the downticks. And so we see a steady increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels as a result. And right now we're about 48% above the pre-industrial atmospheric levels. This should be cause for major concern because human beings are changing the chemistry of the atmosphere, the chemical gases upon which we depend. And captives of the modernist paradigm, I've tried to emphasize how strong our constructed views of reality are. We're tied to this growth model. We're tied to this vision of increasing wealth and increasing material acquisition with such fortitude that we pay almost no attention to the scientific signals that something has gone awry. So again, this is simply a replication of the uptick of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but I could have used any number of other indicators. During this period from the 60s to the present day, what's that, 60 years, we've seen something like 34 climate conferences, a half dozen major international agreements, and so on, none of which have had the slightest effect. You can't detect the advent of any of those conferences, for example, or agreements as having any effect whatsoever on the uptick of carbon dioxide. I suppose you could say it would be worse in the absence of these things, but the point is they have failed to stem the increase in carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And that is, of course, the major source of human anthropogenic climate change. With it, of course, we've seen an increase in global surface temperatures, something like a degree, I think just over a Celsius degree now in the last period since the beginning of the industrial era. There's another symptom I want to pay a little bit of attention to, and that's the impact of human beings on other forms of life on the planet. And one of the best known, I suppose, are wild mammals. Most people are familiar with mammals, not so much some of the other creatures. But if we go back again 10,000 years, wild mammals comprised over 99% of the total biomass, the sheer weight of mammals on Earth. And humans were much less than 1%. If we move forward to the present era, things have changed rather dramatically. We see that human beings now comprise the sheer weight of humans, that's all 7.8 billion of us, is now 32% of all the mammalian biomass on the planet. And by the way, the biomass is considerably larger than it was because of the enhanced productivity of ecosystems. But in addition to humans, cattle now comprise something like 45% of mammalian biomass, and other livestock kicks in another 22%. So together, humans and their domestic animal stock comprise approaching 98%. There's different estimates of this, but they're all 95 to 98% of the total mammalian biomass on planet Earth. And that means that wild animals, the wild mammals that we see on such wonderful nature shows, are reduced to living on the fringes at merely 1.5% of total biomass. And some people, when I've presented these data, have questioned it. It can't be true. But just think for a moment here in North America, for those of you in North America, of the bison populations on the Great Plains. 200 years ago, there were 40, perhaps 60 million bison that regularly migrated north and south through the Great Plains of North America. That was an enormous biomass of mammals. And together with them were millions of pronghorns and other deer. Well, deer, pronghorns aren't deer, bears, wolves, all sorts of wildlife, plus a small stock of human beings, the original people who lived here before Europeans came. Well, the question arises, where are those bison now? And the answer is they're sitting in your seats, because with the expansion of the human enterprise, particularly European humans into the Great Plains of North America, we've completely displaced the original inhabitants, not only human inhabitants, but other wildlife inhabitants. We've replaced their natural fodder, the natural prairie grasses and so on, with wheat, oat, barley, canola, and so on and so forth to feed that mass of human beings and our livestock. So what we have seen over the past 150 or 200 years in particular, with this massive expansion of humankind, is literally the competitive displacement of other forms of life from the planet. The mass of humans is literally displacing other people from their ecosystems, other species from their ecosystems as we expand. And that means, by the way, I should have mentioned this earlier, it's not just mammals. Those of us who are bird watchers have noticed with dismay that bird populations are also tumbling. Poultry, for example, now constitutes something like 70 to 75% of the world's bird biomass. And the average populations of thousands of species that are monitored each year are in decline. Some estimates up to 60% since 1970. So we're seeing a plunging biodiversity on the planet. And it extends also into the invertebrates, the insects, the pollinators, all of them being in free fall. Butterflies are down by 53%, beetles 49%, bumblebees 46%, and so on. So what we find then is wisdom in this, recognizing, if we look at these data for what they tell us, that some social constructs tend to be shared illusions. So the notion, for example, that one hears over and over again during elections, at least in my country, that we can have no conflict, or we can have economic growth and expansion of the economy and a clean environment, is a myth, a shared illusion. Because what the data show is that, contrary to this conventional political wisdom, there is an absolute conflict between the growth of the human enterprise and the protection of nature, the conservation of the environment. The continuous growth of the human enterprise on a finite planet necessarily means the displacement, sometimes to the point of extinction, of non-human species. But because this is what we do, modern humans are systematically destroying the biophysical basis of their own existence, because we can't survive in the absence of wild nature. It is functional ecosystems and large-scale biophysical systems that provide the life support services upon which the human enterprise depends. Not just humans, of course, but all other life on Earth as well. So we're trying to solve this problem. I suppose we can say that there's been an environmental movement for the past at least 60 years, since Rachel Carson's, I suppose many people tie Rachel Carson to the beginning of the environmental movement with the publication of her book, Silent Spring. But how do we attempt to solve the problem? Well, we solve it through our conventionally, socially constructed neoliberal economic growth lens. So in effect, the modernist solution is completely self-referencing. It cannot see outside of itself for other information to bring to bear on this problem. So that we attempt to solve the problem through precisely the processes that brought it to us in the first place. And I'll just give you two quick examples of this. Back in the 1960s, population began to be a major concern. Paul Ehrlich published a famous book called The Population Bomb, for example. Back then, we talked about population control, about family planning, about trying to get a global model together of what the human population might look like. Today, as we move forward, all that conversation has disappeared. And a very recent paper, just published a couple of months ago, concludes that we find a strong and increasing focus on feeding the world through increased food production via improved technology. Population planning has declined from being the dominant lever discussed in 1969 to being almost not researched whatever in 2018. So we've seen the shift away from, in effect, a kind of, I suppose, demand management towards simply supply management. We can increase the productivity of the ecosystems through technology. We will clear enough forests, and by the way, displacing more of wild nature to produce food for humankind. We will grow our food technologically in laboratories instead of having to go out and kill meat and so on and so forth. So the whole discussion around population control, which by the way is still a taboo a subject in many respects, has shifted to being a technological discussion. Similarly, climate change. Everyone knows that climate change is potentially catastrophic. And we know also, at least by publication of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, by the Paris Accord in 2015, that we need to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions by about 50% below 2010 levels in just the next 10 years. Okay, we need to achieve essentially complete decarbonization by 2050. Well, how might we go about that? And if we look at the major discussions around the planet, including those at the meetings such as the Paris Accord, the politically acceptable solutions include any capital intensive investment, wind and solar power. In other words, we need to solve this problem through technology. We have to develop new means of extracting carbon from the atmosphere. Anything that will maintain the existing growth-oriented economic order, okay? Serious conservation, demand reduction, lifestyle changes, more equitable distribution, and other social factors are simply not on the table. It's a technological solution derived and seen through our technologically engineered mythic construct that humankind is in control of this situation and can solve our problems through more of the same, okay? In a sense, disaster policy is being designed to serve the capitalist growth economy, so that, quote, the latter becomes the solution to rather than the cause of the problem, as one very prominent political scientist recently put it. Some editorial cartoons say it all, and I think this is really one of the best in this domain. It's not a question of saving the environment. Most people have no comprehension of the degree to which we are utterly dependent on that environment, partially because of the lag effects. It may be some time before the damage we've now done appears as something that we need to be concerned about. A decade or more may pass. So our immediate attention is on job creation, increasing our incomes, saving the economy from the plague, for example, that we're currently enduring, rather than any focus on the environment. I think it's worth looking at least a little bit at one of the prominent solutions here. If we think about the IPCC goal of 50%, roughly 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, that means reducing our emissions by about 7.5% per year, beginning immediately. 7.5% per year is an enormous change. And one way of doing it would be to implement alternative energy. So what we would all like to see, or at least the mainstream would like to see, is a replacement of our fossil fuel energy with alternative energy that gives us the same quantitative amount of energy. We don't want to change, we don't want to reduce. So let's get the same amount of energy using alternatives. But in a growth economy, this becomes very difficult. And what this plot shows is the annual global production of solar photovoltaic electricity. That's the smooth curve at the bottom. And that's the total produced by all of the installations over the last several decades of solar photovoltaics. The blue curve is the annual increase in demand for electricity. And what this shows is that the annual increase in demand up until at least 2018 exceeded the total output of all our installed photovoltaics. So the installation of photovoltaics isn't sufficient even to keep up with the increase in demand for electricity. The difference, of course, is being made up primarily still by fossil fuels. And keep in mind that we're only dealing here with electricity, which is about 20% of total energy demand. We're not really able yet to electrify many of the industrial processes and transportation requirements of the global economy. So the pursuit of alternative energy in a growth mode is really not going to be a solution to this problem. And in any case, the energy transition is simply not happening in the kind of framing that we're looking at here. So as matters stand, the expansion of the human enterprise resembles what I call the plague phase of a one-off boom-bust population cycle common in nature. Now, this curve shows us, it's just taken from a standard textbook on biology, it shows that any species population, and I underscore this, that humans are no different from other populations, given a release from negative feedback constraints, given an abundance of resources, every known population will go through a period of exponential expansion. So we call that the boom phase. But at some point, in the case of the simple graphic, nutrients are depleted. It could be in the human context that we run out of energy, for example, or that food becomes a problem once again, or there's not enough land. And if there's not a managed descent, there will be a bust phase. So what goes up must come down. And in nature, it can be fairly rough. These are real data from two kind of natural experiments. They weren't intended as experiments. But during the war, we saw the introduction of reindeer to two islands off Alaska, the Pribilof Islands. Plentiful supplies of lichens, the perfect food for reindeer. So the populations went through this classic exponential growth phase, peaked out and then crashed because the lichens were overgrazed and there was no fallback position for those reindeer. In 1972, I believe it was, a very famous book, at least famous to some of us who were around then, called Limits to Growth was published. It was a very crude, in many respects, computer model, and it predicted that humankind, on the trajectory that had already been established in the 1970s, would at some point in the 20th century, toward the middle part, or not 20th century, the 21st century, toward the middle part of this century, would begin to overpollute its environment, run out of certain key resources, and so on. And ultimately, if those trends were to continue in the base case of the standard run, human civilization was exposing itself to the danger of collapse, just as these species have collapsed and just as our classical models show that collapse becomes inevitable. Well, economists and other humanists absolutely despised the limits to growth. It was discarded, it was denigrated, it was critiqued, it was essentially buried from sight in an absolute avalanche of criticism that suggested it couldn't possibly be right because the authors of Limits to Growth simply hadn't taken into account adequately human technological ingenuity. That surely human beings were smart enough to avoid collapse because we could continue to increase the productivity of the human enterprise through the efficiency gains and simple advances in technology. And so with that, again, socially constructed, ebullient framing of the problem, the notion of limits to growth for human society disappeared from the agenda. And it wasn't until just a few years ago that people began to get curious and ask a very simple question. How has it turned out? How have real world trends behaved since the publication of Limits to Growth? So what we have here is a study undertaken by the Netherlands, the Dutch Environmental Assessment Agency, and they plotted, in this case, the population of humankind. These are the purple dots against the limits to growth projections, and you'll see that, boy, it's a pretty good match. And over here we see a plot of actual industrial output against the limits to growth model. That's pretty good too. Here's a decline in the availability of non-renewable resources. There's the model's projections, there's the real world data, and so on. And so basically what the updated versions of limits to growth look like is pretty much what the models told us would likely to happen if we stayed with our present trajectory. And of course, that's exactly what we intended to do. Now, in theory, and I emphasize that this is just a theoretical observation, excuse me, humans should be able to avoid implosion. We should be able to avoid the catastrophic collapse that often happens when a population goes through its plague phase. And there are several reasons for this. First of all, we are gifted with high intelligence, our capacity for logical analysis, and I hope some of what I'm saying fits into that description. We're capable of reasoning from the evidence. And using those kinds of skills, we are uniquely capable among the creatures on this planet to plan ahead. We have the capacity, in theory, to change the futures to our benefit. We also have two other qualities that are extremely important, to some degree shared with other species, but certainly expressed in humans to an exceptional degree, and that is the capacity to exercise moral judgment and the ability to feel empathy or compassion for not only other people, but other species as well. And I want to underscore these last two qualities in a moment. But the point is then that with these four qualities, there's dozens of others, but I think these are exceptionally important. We should be able to avoid implosion. So, problem is that logic, reason, and compassion have never been the primary determinants of human affairs. Anyone who doubts this, there's a number of wonderful books that might be consulted, but a fine one on the historical side of things is Barbara Tuchman's The March of Folly. Here's a quote: "Wooden-headedness plays a remarkably large role in government. It consists of assessing a situation in terms of preconceived notions, ideology, in other words, that social construction again, while ignoring any contrary signs. It is acting according to wish, while not allowing oneself to be deflected from the facts, or by the facts rather." Now, if I may say so, it looks to me as if the administration in the United States fits that model pretty well at this point in time, particularly illustrated through its response to the COVID-19 viral contamination. But we don't have to look at contemporary society. It's been known for some time, this human quality of optimism. We can go back to a very famous volume from the 19th century of Gustave Le Bon, a study of human beings called The Crowd. The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduces them. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. And what Le Bon was emphasizing here again is that humans get together in societies and create socially construct comfortable myths by which they live. And once these myths are in place, we don't like to be distracted by or from them by contrary evidence. Again, an editorial cartoon captures this really exceedingly well. The problem with your reasoned solutions is that they don't fit my preconceived notions of the problems. And now we even have an explanatory cognitive mechanism. It turns out that during the development of the individual, our sensory experiences, repeated ideas, repeated ideological framings, and so on and so forth, literally help to shape the synaptic circuits developing in the brain. So we develop neural pathways that tend to embed and replicate those oft repeated experiences. And once these are in place, subsequently people tend to seek out compatible experiences. You tend to seek out events and other people who reinforce your pre-established beliefs and assumptions and values. So look how powerful this notion of social construction is. Humans have a template upon which social circumstances can write a script. Once the script is in place, it becomes extremely difficult to break from. In fact, people want to reinforce the script as they have learned it. And when faced with information that does not agree with these preformed internal structures, we deny, discredit, reinterpret, or forget that information. And a wonderful little book that summarizes much of the research that's gone into this reality is a little book by Bruce Wexler called Brain and Culture. So this becomes particularly problematic today because we are in a period of what I think of as a socially engineered period in which we have been trained. Most of society has been trained to ignore reality. We are in a socially constructed age of unreason, or the endarkenment. The 2016 Oxford Dictionary word of the year was post-truth, because we saw that bandied about along, but the important thing is that it relates to or denotes circumstances in which facts are less influential in shaping opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So we live in an era in which our politics is increasingly influenced by neoliberal ideology, religious fundamentalism, climate change, denial, anti-intellectualism, and other forms of magical thinking that aren't rooted in any form of reality. And again, a wonderful editorial cartoon showing that people lining up for the theater of the reassuring lie, and avoiding utterly the inconvenient truth that would have to make them, that would require that they actually change their comfortable ways of being. So we've come to the point where we have to recognize that social construction, which is part of our problem, must also be part of our solution. We are now at a point in the world where we have to seriously question the narrative that has brought us to this point of crisis, which of course requires that we recognize that we are in a point of crisis. We have to first of all acknowledge that we are part of nature, that nothing about our technological ingenuity separates us from our complete dependence on the natural world. This requires, secondly, that we recognize limits to material growth, that on a finite planet, the human enterprise cannot expand indefinitely, because the way we expand is by literally converting the biosphere into humanness, into the bodies of human beings and the massive infrastructure on our planet that supports humans and nothing else. We've become the largest geological force changing the face of the earth. The materials moved around to create our cities, our highways, our vehicles, our toys, and so on and so forth, exceeds all the materials moved by nature through erosion and so on and so forth. We need to acknowledge that a new system is required to satisfy our need for love, for spiritual fulfillment, for community, and ecological, along with economic security. So we've really reached the juncture in our, I suppose, cultural evolution, where we have to transcend techno-modernism, this techno-industrial society that has brought us to the brink of collapse, I think literally, and we need to catalyze a personal to civilizational change, a transition, a transformation to a new way of being on Earth, in which we can live spiritually satisfying lives, more equitably, but well within the biophysical means of the planet that supports us. And that's my main message today. It's time for change, and it's up to us to catalyze that change because our lives depend upon it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that inspiring and disturbing and brilliant talk. I am sure there are all kinds of questions that it raises in each of our minds and hearts as we think about the human present and the human future. I have a question that I want to pose first of all. It's already submitted by Chuck Fowler. But before I do so, let me remind everyone that the queue for questions is now open. I've got 7 or so that have already been posed, but we will try to work through as many as we can. As we thank Bill and pose questions that will challenge our conversation going forward for the next 30 minutes or so. Once again, at the bottom center of your box, you will see, of your screen, I should say, you will see a Q&A link. Click on that, type in your question, and I will monitor them here and pose them. First question, though, has already been posed by a good friend of Iris, Dr. Chuck Fowler. And what he asks, Bill, is for you to reflect. What do you see as necessary on the part of the religions of the world as belief systems to rectify the predicament that we face?
Well, can everyone hear me? Am I back on? Nice, easy question, Dr. Fowler. Thank you very much. I'm glad that you're still part of this. I think we have to think this question through by starting with a brief summary of what I've tried to say here. We are today in a world which is dedicated or dominated by economic thinking, that almost everything is deferent to the economy. We assume technological wizardry can carry us forward. We also have a major political problem in that we now seem to have politics by poll. There are no great world leaders who inspire as some past leaders might have done. They're simply too anxious to become reelected, to retain power at all costs. So in many respects, we're in the worst of all possible worlds again, dominated by economic thinking, which, by the way, eschews any consideration of moral or ethical considerations. We think technology can be our savior. So we put more and more of our effort into advancing technology, and it too is bereft of any connection to community, to family, or anything of that nature. And we have a corrupt politics that is failing to get us anywhere. So it seems to me that if we're going to talk about the role of religion in all of this, there is an enormous void So the very short answer to Chuck's question might be that religion and religious leaders should begin to do their job, which is to raise to the center of public debate the moral and ethical obligations that we have as a people, not only to ourselves, but to other peoples and to other species on this planet. So the proper domain for religion is to critique the ways in which, it seems to me, the techno-industrial society is engaged in the accelerating ecological destruction, which surely must be seen as the degradation of God's creation. If one happens to be religious, that's how I would certainly perceive it. We have to understand that throughout this entire period of massive growth, which we're told over and over again, is intended to solve our problems of inequity and poverty in particular, it's done no such thing. Now we'll hear over and over again how the last 20 years of enormous economic growth has solved, or at least relieved us from much of the most chronic absolute poverty. But the reality is that there are more impoverished people on planet Earth today than there were human beings on planet Earth in 1950 or 1960. So that despite this enormous growth, despite the enormous accumulation of wealth and capital, we have seen a period in the last 30 years of increasingly egregious income disparity. So that a handful of billionaires now control as much of the world's wealth as the poorest 50%, almost 4 billion of human beings. So again, if I were really in a position to instruct religious leaders, it would be to come together and to prepare a paper for the world, a kind of white paper on the future. Why can't we get the popes and our archbishops and imams and priests and monks to agree that humans are in a crisis situation in which we have a moral and ethical responsibility to ourselves, to other humans, and to the creation that the planet represents, to pull back from the brink, to socially construct a new reality, which will enable us to do, as I said in my last slide, to live within the biocapacity of the planet more equitably and on less. So my vision of the future is one in which we reassume the capacity that we have, the unique capacities as moral and ethical creatures, and guide ourselves accordingly. We cease to be guided by the mere mechanics of economics and scientific advance. Can they do that? Will they come together? Where have the great religious voices been as this COVID crisis overtakes the planet? And it's a minor one compared to what will happen should massive climate change or major energy shortages strike the earth and we can no longer provide the food and other resources needed to support the anticipated billions of people. End of my story.
Yeah, thank you. Let me remind everyone we're listening to Dr. William Rees, and we're posing questions. If you have a question, go to the Q&A box on the bottom. Ashwani, on our participant list here, writes that he agrees with you. We are in a situation of overshoot. Now, what is to be done? How do we catalyze the change that we need? And I could elaborate that a little bit. You're looking to religion to play a significant role, religions of the future, I might add, not the religious institutions of the present or the past necessarily, but you're looking to religion to play a major role. Can science itself inspire the change that we need?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'm very glad you posed it. We've chatted before, I guess, online, Ashwani. Science obviously has a huge role to play here because we wouldn't even be aware of many dimensions of this problem, of our predicament, as it were, without the scientific analyses that have led us so starkly to confront it. But science in itself is insufficient. People will not save that which they do not love. People don't act out of logic. If science were the solution here, then that constant uptick of carbon emissions could not possibly have occurred over a period of 50 years and 26 major conferences and 6 major international agreements. I guess there were 34 conferences. The point is, the science is not enough. People have to have a sense of personal engagement. They have to be emotionally charged in order to respond. And unless we can engage people at that level, where they can perceive that their lives, their families are indeed threatened by the changes that are about us, they're not going to move. So religion can play a role, science can both play a role, but human beings have to become better informed. They have to, it seems to be, accept the nature of our predicament, as well as the kind of really contortionist changes that need to take place if we're going to really move forward. I have to come clean here. Some problems may be insolvable. We have created a system of systems. If you think of the global system of the internet, global transportation, airlines, the integrated economy, the massive societies that we have of billions in places like China and India, each of these is a hugely complex system in and of itself. And increasingly, they've become integrated, so that we have a situation of overlapping systems that overlap with complex biophysical systems, such as the climate system, the rainfall cycle, and so on and so forth, any one of which is beyond human comprehension. And yet here we are, humble little beasts trying to control the whole thing. It really is beyond the capacity of any one human mind to get around it. And it's very humbling to accept that. We have to admit almost complete ignorance in the face of these problems and start over. That's what a civilizational transformation really is. It's a starting over, accepting where we are now, accepting that it is a course toward a collapse situation in which there will be great agony for billions of people, and work toward thinking our way through it. Now, that's a very unsatisfactory answer, but I can't think of a better one right now. It's not technological, it's not political, it's not economic, it's all of those things, but the solution has to come from this regenerative capacity of humans to socially construct a new reality that conforms to what we know about the external reality. We are faltering right now because our social constructs do not conform to the biophysical reality in which we find ourselves. Our mental model of the economy does not operate the way real societies with real people, with real families and real communities. So until we have a model that conforms to the external reality and the nature of humankind, this becomes a very, very much more difficult problem.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Let me combine elements of two questions, one from Mark and one from Katie. Who is this us? Who is this global humanity? And Katie poses this particular question. Now, are there particular people, organizations, or ideas that you might want to lift up as pointing us in the right direction?
Frankly, on the scale of the problem we're talking about now, no, I don't know of any. Okay, maybe IRIS is one of those. Maybe it could expand to fill some kind of intellectual gap here. But clearly the United Nations is foundering. We don't have international organizations that even appreciate the vision that I'm talking about. In fact, we don't have international organizations that really accept the nature of our predicament. Certainly the International Energy Agency, the United Nations, or any of these major mainstream organizations do not. What gives me real hope is the emergence at the community level of various organizations that talk about local production for local consumption, about in effect reconfiguring economy and society on a spatial and temporal scale which the human mind could wrap itself around. It doesn't mean isolationism, but it does mean the recreation or the, I suppose, relocalization of decision-making and manufacturing and a variety of other things that humans depend on to the spatial scale that that we can recognize, that we can control. And by the way, if the whole of the planet were working in a number of cells like this, any one of them that failed wouldn't necessarily take the rest down. One of the problems we have now is that the form of globalization we have, and I think this is being revealed more and more with the COVID epidemic, is that we have these supply chains that are global in reach, but if they get broken, the whole system falls in. We become utterly, I've called it an unsustainable entanglement of nations on this global scale, because we've modeled it after the demands of the economic system, which focus on efficiency and efficiency alone. But in that process, we've abandoned the ideas of resilience, of community, of self-reliance, and a whole variety of other values that are perhaps more important at this time of crisis than the mere efficiency of the global economy. So another movement that I think is making great waves here is something called the degrowth movement. It's an organization, largely European at the present time, although we have had a couple of conferences in North America as well, oriented to recognizing that the human enterprise must shrink, it must accommodate itself to the envelope of the ecosphere. And in order to maintain some kind of internal integrity, we must therefore share the bounty much more equitably. It's completely egregious to have a half a dozen or 15 billionaires with the same wealth as half of the human population. That must come to an end. And we have to design ways of doing that. Look, I'm raving here, but if you go back just to the 1970s, I'll use the US as an example, assuming that most of our audience is from the US. Are you aware that when President Nixon was in place, I think the marginal tax rate for the 1% was 91%. Today it's 37%. So over the past 30 or 40 years, we've seen this gradual change in the tax system, which is guaranteed that the wealthier get wealthier, the wealthy get wealthier, and the poor stagnate. And so we have more people in poverty in the United States today, the richest country on the planet, than ever before in its history. This is the beginning of a breakdown in the social contract. Why should people be loyal to governments and to institutions that have done them in, so to speak, and systematically over this period of time? Because there's been, governments have almost been captured by a certain corporate mentality that has taken us down a pathway toward this egregious inequality while destroying the environment. So again, until we raise to consciousness in the minds of people that this is the reality in which we are embedded, we're not going to be propelled to act to change anything. In fact, we've been compelled to think that this is the way it should be. I mean, look how many people are defending their right not to wear a mask because who are you in government to tell me what I should do? Well, that's precisely the wrong attitude to have at the present time in a time of crisis.
Thank you. Yeah, let's return our attention to the theme of religion here again. And I want to modify a little bit a question posed by Richard. He writes, how does our notion of God and salvation need to change in order for us to reconstruct our socially constructed reality? Now, these are the terms that we ordinarily associate with Christianity, so you can take it in kind of a number of different directions, post-traditional as you wish. But what does our symbol, our global human symbol of supreme goodness and beauty, or God, look like? Seems to me you've said a lot about what damnation looks like. I mean, I can only imagine what lies at the bottom of the bust curve if you're thinking of population loss, apocalyptic population lost. That sounds an awful lot like damnation or hell, again, to resort to Christian categories. But particularly, what does salvation look like? What does it look like for humanity to live together, contented in our own selves and in our social relationships, but in our relationship ultimately with nature?
Well, it's a huge question, and I'm probably not the best person to even attempt an answer, because in the science and religion spectrum, I'm over on the science side. I am not myself a particularly religious person. But having said that, you know, there are models out there that I think we should elevate to the fore. For one thing, when I was a child, I was in a very religious family, but I was learning about science. And I developed a way of integrating the two. I thought of evolution. By the way, I believe in evolution, but I began to think of it as God's creative process during my religious phase. So if I were to adopt that model today and look at humankind as a process of God's creative, as a product rather of the God's creative process, then I would look again at those qualities that I listed earlier. Our capacity for reasoned analysis, our capacity for compassion, our capacity for planning ahead. We need to honor God, if I were to put it in those terms, by exercising the capacities he or she or it has given us before we can rise to full humanness. I mean, to be fully human is to exercise those unique capacities that we do not share with other species. And I would underscore that if we simply continue to act in this completely mechanistic, hell or high water kind of attitude, then we're not honoring the creative process. We are not honoring our capacities to become fully human by overriding the tendencies which have now become maladaptive. Perhaps I should have underscored that a little bit earlier. I've made the point several times that humans, like all other species, have a natural predisposition to expand. And in evolutionary terms, that was absolutely necessary for survival. That was the life force, as it were. Okay. But because we've obeyed it so well, and because we've applied our other qualities of high intelligence to manipulation of the material environment, we've now so changed the quality of the natural environment that a quality that was adaptive 10,000 years ago has become maladaptive today. It is no longer adaptive for humans to exercise this predisposition for unlimited growth and material acquisition. This is an intellectual realization that we have to, as it were, operationalize. Now that we have reached the point where everybody could have enough, we have to socially construct a model of, I suppose, enoughness, where we recognize that we have acquired the capacity to ensure ecological stability and economic security for human beings, that we need not struggle any longer to acquire and to grow and to do all of the things that were absolutely necessary 10,000 years ago. And then we have to look around us for models that might work in these new circumstances. Some years ago, I was involved in studies in the far north among Canadian Inuit. And we noticed a great increase in the numbers of suicides among young males in Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic. And this corresponded with the beginnings of oil and gas development in the Beaufort Sea region, for example. Now, to make a long story short, a part of the government's licensing process was to force companies to employ First Nations or Inuit people in their operations in the far north. So in compliance, many young men who were still part of the earlier Inuit cultures were brought into the work camps, given menial tasks or trained to drive trucks and that sort of thing. But they got very high paying jobs, is what I'm saying in the end. Now, let's go back a bit. Prior to the oil and gas exploration, these communities were hunter-gatherer societies, let's face it. And if I were out on a hunt and I got a seal, I brought it back to my village and it was cut up and apportioned among other members of the community. And if somebody else got a seal, the same thing would happen. So that each of us who was able to acquire our game shared it with the rest of the community. But when I went out and got a job, what I did was not share that money. Young men were not sharing the money. They would buy a new snowmobile, they'd get a better rifle, they'd buy a 4x4 truck to drive on the 3 kilometers of road in the community. But then when the oil and gas went bust, these young men were left without a job. They were not accepted into the dominant mainstream community. They were no longer accepted by their own communities because they had isolated themselves by acquiring the individualistic selfishness of the modern, wage employment. They became socially and culturally isolated, and the suicide rates went up. At least that's how the story seemed to unfold. But the main point of this is to say that you can imagine a form of being in which the achievements of any one individual were shared among other people in that same community, in a kind of mutualism in which I was secure and you were secure, because each of us was looking out for the other in these circumstances of relative resource scarcity, for example. Now, it seems to me we are headed toward a period, if our energy supply dries up or food supplies become jeopardized by climate change and so on, where we may have to recognize that resource scarcity becomes a pattern of the future. Then we need to have ways of thinking about this that enable us to have a soft landing. It needn't be a collapse. It could be a controlled contraction toward a state, a population level, a level of economic consumption, which was satisfactory, sufficient to enable us to actualize our other elements of our capacities. I mean, once our material things are taken care of, we've made a fetish of getting more and more. Why not make a fetish of getting better and better, at being a member of the community, at exercising our political rights, at serving the community in ways that don't mean I acquire more and more stuff, but means we all live together better because we are in a mutualistic kind of circumstance. You see, human behavior is like a piano keyboard. There are, 84 notes. And we've been down here thumping away on the bass notes. The selfishness, we are selfish. We've ignored the sharing notes, the compassion notes, and so on. So we now have to shift the tune, as it were, to the higher end of this spectrum of sounds so that we're playing the better notes of our human nature, so to speak, which will enable us to live together on the planet within the means of nature and as community within the means of community.
Thank you so much. We have time, I think, for one more very brief question, and I'm afraid, Bill, also it'll require a brief answer.
I apologize for rambling on and on.
This is why we're having you here. These rich and detailed comments are really, really insightful. But let's end. Tariq poses this, and just respond from the heart. Let us recognize that we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children.
Amen. Absolutely. And
indeed. Thank you so much. Our guest has been Professor Dr. William Rees. And thank you to our audience joining us from as far away as India. Thank you to Iris for sponsoring this and to Star Island.